rising like enormous stone fortresses across empty, windswept landscapes. Early 20th century mental hospitals were built to impress and intimidate. Their design followed something called the Kirkbride Plan, created by psychiatrist Thomas Story. Kirkbride in the late 1800s, he believed that the building itself could help treat patients, that its walls, towers, and wings were more than just shelter. They were part of the cure. Kirkbride's ideas spread across the country, shaping over 70 hospitals, each costing millions of dollars, which would be tens of millions in today's money. These hospitals were massive. Take the Buffalo State Hospital, built in 1871, by renowned architect Henry Hobson Richardson. Its walls of thick Medina sandstone stretched more than 2,200 feet, crowned with two towering copper-capped spires that reached 185 feet high. The structure bristled with Victorian Gothic details, giving it a look both grand and forbidding. People called it the Castle. Dr. James Dean, the hospital's superintendent from 1900 to 1912, wrote that the very architecture seemed to speak to patients' souls, constantly reminding them of their separation from the outside world. Building the hospital required over 8 million bricks and 200 stonemasons, working for 3 long years. Despite the care put into its construction, the hospital was often overcrowded. By 1935, it held 3,800 patients, even though it had been built for just 600. Massachusetts Worcester State Hospital, rebuilt in 1901 after a fire, was considered modern for its time. Its corridors stretched nearly a mile, with patient wings arranged in long straight lines. The superintendent, Dr. Hosea Quinby, argued that this layout helped separate different types of patients and prevent mixing grades of insanity. In reality, the situation inside was grim. Former nurse Elizabeth Clark, in her 1918 diary, described hallways filled with screams at night, the stench of unwashed bodies and filthy bedding spreading through every corner. She wrote that 1,800 patients were crowded into spaces meant for 1,200. Its most notorious section, the violent ward in the farthest wing, held patients in tiny 6 by 8 foot cells. Some people spent over a decade in those cramped rooms, never stepping outside. Danvers State Hospital, perched high on Hathorne Hill in Massachusetts, became infamous for its harsh conditions and striking Gothic design. Opened in 1878, it stretched 1,700 feet from end to end, with a central tower visible for miles. In 1923, reformer Dorothea Dix reported that dormitories built for 20 people were crammed with 40, many sleeping on thin mats on the floor. Damp walls dripped with condensation, rats ran freely through the halls at night, and the air was thick with fear. Architect Nathaniel Bradley included symbolic touches, 13 towers to represent the original American colonies, and designs reflecting Christ and his apostles. The hospital also had over 2 miles of underground tunnels, used not only for utilities, but to discreetly transport deceased patients to the morgue. By 1939, the hospital held 2,360 patients, with just 1 doctor for every 250 people. Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, built in 1876, was another monumental institution. For decades, it held the title of the largest continuous foundation in the U.S., a record it kept until the Pentagon was built. Like its counterparts, it was designed to awe and intimidate, its halls filled with the sounds of restless patients, the shadows of its Gothic towers stretching long over the grounds. Walking through these hospitals must have felt like stepping into another world. The walls were meant to heal, but they also imprisoned. Behind every tower, corridor, and tiny cell, there were stories of suffering, overcrowding, and fear. Patients lived side by side with misery and madness, while the architects' grand visions loomed over them, silent and unyielding. The main building, a massive Second Empire Victorian structure, was so huge that by 1927 it held over 7,700 patients, almost 5 times more than it was built for. Mary Jane Ward, a former patient and author of The Snake Pit, described the overcrowding. "We slept head to foot in rows so tight that you couldn't even walk between the beds. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and disinfectant. Constructing the building had been a monumental task, using 673,700 cubic feet of stone and nearly 40 million bricks. In 1908, the hospital ran a farm colony where patients worked as part of their therapy. They produced over 260,000 pounds of vegetables and maintained a dairy herd of 490 cows, making the hospital largely self-sufficient, all while the labor went unpaid. Life inside these institutions followed strict daily routines designed to keep order among thousands of patients. At Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, which housed more than 14,000 people by 1954 and was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world, schedules were almost military-like. A surviving 1925 timetable shows a 5:30 a.m. rise, cold baths at 6 o'clock, a 15-minute breakfast at 6:30, ward cleaning at 7 o'clock, and mandatory yard time at 8 o'clock weather permitting. Dr. William J. Tiffany, superintendent from 1931 to 1943, carefully tracked patient labor, showing they performed over 100,000 hours of unpaid work each month, worth roughly $25,000 in $1,935. The hospital's kitchen prepared 42,000 meals daily, using industrial-sized machines, including a coffee maker capable of brewing 600 gallons at once. Even the architecture was designed to control behavior. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, built from hand-cut limestone blocks, featured long, straight corridors so staff could observe patients from a distance. Designer Richard Andrews called this therapeutic architecture, using high ceilings for air circulation, large windows for sunlight, and separate wings for different patient groups. Construction began in 1858 and continued through the Civil War, when the Union Army briefly used it as a military post. The limestone came from nearby Moundsville Penitentiary, with each block weighing 200 to 800 pounds. By 1938, the asylum housed 2,400 patients in space built for just $250. Dr. Arthur Noyes described it in his inspection as being more suited to housing cattle than human beings. Records from 1924 show patients were divided into 23 categories, from acute melancholia to religious paranoia, each group placed in specially designed sections. In California, the Camarillo State Mental Hospital, opened in 1936, tried to move away from the Gothic style, adopting the Spanish colonial revival look. Its sprawling 1,500-acre campus included open-air corridors and courtyards, which Superintendent Dr. Thomas Harris claimed would help patients heal by giving them fresh air and sunshine. Jazz legend Charlie Parker was treated here in 1946, giving the hospital the nickname "The Last Resort," famously immortalized in the Eagles song Hotel California. But behind the beautiful exterior, former attendant James Miller wrote in 1943 about grim realities: patients left sitting in their own filth, some chained to benches in courtyards for days. The hospital even had its own police force and fire department. By 1957, it held over 7,000 patients, cared for by 1,800 staff members. Living conditions varied widely. At McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, wealthy patients enjoyed private rooms with personal attendants, while those in public wards slept in crowded dormitories. Poet Robert Lowell, treated there in 1958, captured this contrast in his writing, describing the blue despair of waking up in a room where his day makes my agonized blue window bleaker, and crows mourn on the petrified fairway. Absence tightens the chest like a harpoon sinking in. and fear or longing twists the heart. Dr. Edward Cowles, superintendent from 1879 to 1904, explained this strict separation of patients in his 1908 memoir, Different Social Classes Needed. Different living arrangements to feel comfortable, he argued, and that comfort was essential to recovery. Hospital records from 1912 show the huge gap in costs. Private patients could pay as much as $100 per week, over $2,500 today, while state-supported patients cost the hospital just $3.50 a week. Architects, however, often disguise these hospitals as grand palaces rather than places meant to contain people. The Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan, with its spires and Gothic windows, was called a palace for the mad by visiting journalist Nellie Bly in 1919. It had more than 1,000 windows, each with a unique arch requiring 4 full-time glaziers just to maintain them. Its heating system burned 11,000 tons of coal a year, delivered by its own railway line. But behind that impressive exterior, Bly discovered wards where patients were strapped to beds. Cries of suffering filled the halls, and the grand design only emphasized how cut off patients were from the world outside. A former patient, writing as patient N82, told the Northern Express in 1915 that the building's beauty felt like a cruel joke. It was just a glorified cage. The architectural ideas of these institutions left a lasting mark. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., founded in 1855 as the government's hospital for the insane, introduced cottages instead of large wards. By 1940, its campus spread across 350 acres with 112 buildings. Chief architect Thomas U. Walter, who also designed the U.S. Capitol Dome, added circular wards so one nurse could watch all the patients from a central station. Notable patients included presidential assassin Charles Guiteau and poet Ezra Pound. Dr. William Allinson, superintendent from 1903 to 1937, wrote in his memoirs that these buildings were more than shelters. They were tools designed to control and manage the chaos of the mind. Every brick, every stone, he claimed, was placed to help contain patients, and the tools inside cages, needles, and isolation revealed the grim reality behind the walls. The treatments themselves were often horrifying. In the dim corridors of early 20th century mental hospitals, doctors experimented in ways that today seem more like torture than care. Between 1900 and 1950, desperate attempts to treat mental illness often caused permanent damage to patients' minds and bodies. London's infamous Bethlehem Royal Hospital, nicknamed Bedlam, became a model for many American institutions. Until 1921, patients were sometimes displayed to paying visitors like exhibits in a human zoo. In America, Dr. Walter Freeman became infamous as the father of the lobotomy. He believed mental illness came from overactive emotions, and cutting the brain's connections to the prefrontal cortex could calm patients' feelings. In 1946, he pioneered the transorbital lobotomy, using an ice pick-like tool inserted through the eye socket. Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies, including the tragic case of Rosemary Kennedy in 1941, the 23-year-old sister of John F. Kennedy, who was left severely disabled and spent the rest of her life in institutions. Freeman's obsession even led him to travel the country in a lobotomobile, a 1940 Chevrolet converted into a mobile operating room, performing surgeries on the road. Some of the most shocking practices in psychiatric care took place right out in the open, even in hospital parking lots. Dr. Walter Freeman, who performed lobotomies across the country, saw his last procedure in 1967, and tragically with the death of Helen Mortensen, a long-term patient who had already undergone the operation twice before. Before lobotomies became popular, hospitals relied on something called moral treatment, which focused on shaping behavior through daily routines. At Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, Dr. Samuel Woodward ran a strict schedule in the early 1900s. Patients worked, attended religious services, and took part in structured social activities. In Woodward's 1912 diary, he wrote that patients needed to learn to control themselves, obey authority, and stay busy with useful work. Some hospitals pushed this approach to extremes. Willard State Hospital in New York made patients work up to 12 hours a day on its farms. Records from 1915 show they grew over 2,000 pounds of vegetables and cared for a dairy herd of 200 cows. Patient labor essentially made the hospital self-sufficient, saving huge sums of money, $175,000 in 1923, which would be over $2.8 million today, all without paying the workers. In 1927, Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sakel accidentally discovered insulin shock therapy while treating patients with drug addiction. The treatment used insulin injections to put patients into hypoglycemic comas, and it quickly spread across Europe and the US at Pilgrim State Hospital in New York. Between 1936 and 1945, over 2,000 patients received insulin shock therapy. Dr. Joseph Wurtis reported an 88% cure rate for schizophrenia, though later studies showed many relapsed. And some patients died from prolonged comas. Dr. Harold Bourne criticized the treatment in 1938, saying, "We are not treating diseases. We are treating human beings whose problems cannot be solved by putting them into comas." Still, institutions like Creedmoor State Hospital continued the therapy. 450 patients received it in 1940 alone, and 17 died. Perhaps the most controversial and long-lasting treatment was electroconvulsive therapy, OPUCT. It was first developed in 1938 by Italian psychiatrists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini. Their first patient was a 39-year-old engineer wandering the streets of Rome, speaking in gibberish. After the first treatment, Cerletti recalled the patient saying, "Not another one, it's deadly." Despite this warning, the therapy continued and the patient eventually showed improvement. By 1940, ECS had spread to the United States, where it was often given without anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Violent convulsions sometimes broke bones. Its origins were unusual. Doctors first tested the method on pigs in Rome's slaughterhouses, observing that electric shocks caused seizures without killing the animals. The Metropolitan State Hospital in Massachusetts treated 1,443 patients with ECT in 1944 alone. Dr. Abraham Meyerson, a leading psychiatrist of the time, defended side effects like memory loss, writing in 1942 that these people have more intelligence than they can handle, and reducing intelligence is an important part of the cure. At Rockland State Hospital in New York, Dr. David Impastato developed an assembly line system, treating up to 100 patients per day. Hospital corridors became lined with gurneys, each patient waiting their turn for the electric shock. Quiet rooms, isolation rooms, and padded cells, sometimes called timeout rooms, were standard features in nearly every institution, a grim reminder of the strict control doctors exercised over every aspect of patients' lives. Back in the early 1900s, mental hospitals kept strict records of every patient, and what they reveal is both shocking and heartbreaking. At the Friends Asylum in Philadelphia, for example, nearly half of the patients in 1915 spent some time in isolation, sometimes for only a few hours, sometimes stretching into months. These rooms were tiny, often barely large enough for a single bed, and the walls were padded with leather, canvas, or even horsehair to stop patients from hurting themselves. Imagine being trapped in a small, quiet room with no light or company. For days on end, just the sound of your own breathing echoing off the walls. In Massachusetts, the Danvers State Hospital, nicknamed the Castle on the Hill, had basement isolation rooms that became infamous. A staff journal from 1921 described them as dungeons where sunlight never reached and where the unlucky patients lived in almost total darkness, with only the faintest glow from a distant window or lantern. Physical restraints were everywhere. The UA crib, a wooden bed enclosed in a cage, trapped patients inside so they couldn't move. The tranquilizer chair, created by Dr. Benjamin Rush in the 1700s, was still used decades later. At St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., more than 60% of patients were restrained at some point during their stay. The hospital superintendent, Dr. William Alanson White, defended the practice in his 1920 book, saying restraints were sometimes necessary to protect the patient or others, but he insisted they should always be a last resort. Yet the scenes must have been terrifying for anyone inside. Some hospitals took things even further. Nebraska State Hospital introduced the muff, a leather device that completely enclosed a patient's hands, and it quickly spread across the country after being displayed at the 1904 World's Fair. Water treatments, called hydrotherapy, were another common method. Patients might be plunged into cold baths for days or sprayed with high-pressure streams of water from every angle. Dr. John Kerwin of Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital wrote in 1918 that water, in all its forms, was one of the most useful ways to treat patients. At Buffalo State Hospital, Dr. John Pierce invented the needle shower in 1902, shooting thin jets of hot and cold water at patients for hours each day. Some patients were even restrained beneath canvas covers with only their heads exposed, forced to endure the water treatments for days or weeks. The fear, discomfort, and helplessness they must have felt is almost impossible to imagine today. Because there were few effective medicines, doctors often turned to extreme and dangerous experiments. At Dunning State Hospital in Chicago, Dr. Henry Cotton believed mental illness came from infections inside the body. To treat it, he removed teeth, tonsils, and even internal organs from his patients. Between 1919 and 1921, he performed over 1,000 surgeries, and tragically, 30% of his patients died. Despite this, Dr. Cotton insisted he was curing mental illness, and his ideas spread to other hospitals, including the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton. In a cruel twist of fate, Dr. Cotton's own son later needed psychiatric care and had all his teeth removed following the same theory. Even as evidence mounted that these surgeries were harmful and often deadly, the practice continued until Cotton's death in 1933. By the 1940s, people started speaking out. Researchers published studies in the American Journal of Psychiatry, questioning the effectiveness of treatments like insulin shock therapy and lobotomies. Still, without safer alternatives, many hospitals kept using these dangerous methods well into the 1950s. The result was a deep trail of trauma for countless patients, which eventually helped fuel the modern mental health reform movement. One voice that made a huge difference was Frances Farmer, a Hollywood actress institutionalized in the 1940s. Her memoir, Will There Really Be a Morning?, published after her death in 1972, gave a terrifying first-hand account of her experiences. She described enduring insulin shock therapy at Western State Hospital in Washington, exposing the dark reality of the treatments and the suffering they caused. Her story reminded the world that behind every medical experiment were real people, struggling to survive under conditions that no one should ever face. In the shadowy hallways of early 20th century mental asylums, women's voices often echoed quietly, lost behind the thick stone and brick walls of institutions that seemed more like prisons than places of healing. These women were labeled with terms like female hysteria or moral insanity, while their real feelings, frustrations, and fears were ignored or dismissed. Between 1900 and 1950, women made up nearly 3/4 of asylum populations across America and Europe. Their commitments were often based not on genuine mental illness, but on behaviors that challenged strict social rules, behaviors as simple as being independent, outspoken, or refusing to follow a husband's orders. at the Pennsylvania hospital. For the insane in 1907, for instance, 987 of 1,432 patients were women, and more than 40% were diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all label for almost anything society deemed improper in a woman. The roots of this gendered approach to mental health stretch back decades. Dr. Benjamin Rush, often called the father of American psychiatry, wrote in his 1812 medical treatise that women's natural sensitivity made them more prone to madness. He recommended treatment specifically for women, including the tranquilizer chair he invented, which restrained patients in ways that could be terrifying and painful. Female patients were far more likely than men to experience such extreme interventions. Dr. Edward Shorter's records from the Toronto Asylum reveal shocking reasons women were institutionalized: reading novels, showing religious enthusiasm, having disagreements at home, or simply being sent by a husband who didn't approve of her behavior. In 1908, 23-year-old Elizabeth Parker was admitted because she read too many novels and refused to perform marital duties. She spent 8 years locked inside the asylum and ultimately died from tuberculosis in 1916. Similarly, Mary Adelaide Henderson was institutionalized for reading sensational novels and expressing opinions in favor of women's suffrage. Even writers recognized the injustice. Louisa May Alcott, though never institutionalized herself, described the phenomenon in her lesser-known work Behind a Mask, noting that society labeled women mad when their minds tried to escape the dull, confining routine of domestic life. Some individual cases became infamous. Alice Mitchell, admitted to Buffalo State Asylum in 1909, dreamed of studying engineering. Her interests in mechanical work and her masculine tendencies were considered signs of insanity. Her desperate plea, "I am not mad. I simply wish to study engineering. Is this truly a sign of insanity?" was ignored. Mitchell endured 17 years of confinement and was subjected to ice-cold hydrotherapy 3 times a week, a treatment meant to suppress her so-called unnatural passions. She eventually died of pneumonia. Her story was cited in Dr. William A. White's Outlines of Psychiatry as evidence that sexual inversion caused mental disorder. Yet her case also inspired underground feminist publications, including Emma Goldman's Mother Earth, which in 1915 ran an anonymous article titled The Making of Mad Women. During this period, new medical ideas also reinforced harmful stereotypes. About women, Dr. George Miller Beard popularized the diagnosis of neurasthenia, describing it as a distinctly female illness caused by the pressures of modern life on fragile women. By 1910, this diagnosis had become so common that the Massachusetts State Hospital reported that 40% of their female patients were admitted under this category. Hospital records tell the stories of women like Catherine Bartholomew, a suffragette admitted in 1912 for political hysteria and for being excessively excited about women's rights. The hospital superintendent, Dr. James Howard, wrote in his personal diary that any woman who stepped outside her natural sphere inevitably risked mental collapse. These diaries, patient files, and case studies reveal how the psychiatric establishment systematically punished women for challenging society's expectations. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's own ordeal with Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's rest cure further illustrated the dangers of psychiatric treatment for women. Forced to lie in bed for weeks, forbidden from writing or thinking independently, Gilman felt her mind deteriorate under the guise of care. Her story later became a powerful critique, showing how the system often treated women not as patients needing help, but as problems to be controlled. Across America and Europe, thousands of women experienced the same confinement, experimental therapies, and social judgment, leaving a legacy of trauma that shaped early feminist critiques of mental health care. These women's stories, long hidden in asylum records, diaries, and memoirs, reveal a dark chapter in history where fear, control, and misunderstanding defined the treatment of women's minds. In 1887, Charlotte Perkins Gilman went through a month-long treatment that forced her to stay in bed, unable to read, write, or even hold her baby. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's plan, outlined in his 1877 book Fat and Blood, relied on force feeding, rich foods, and keeping patients completely mentally idle. Gilman later recalled in her autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, that following these directions for 3 months nearly drove her to the edge of mental collapse, making her feel as if she could see the border of total insanity. Her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was even sent to Mitchell, who reportedly never replied. The legendary author Virginia Woolf, who faced similar restrictions, called his methods worse than any torture device she had imagined. Records from the Nebraska State Hospital in 1915 show a troubling pattern. Women were 3 times more likely than men to be committed for moral insanity, a catch-all diagnosis that punished everything from reading dangerous books to wearing trousers. One extreme example, Josephine Crawford, was locked away after trying to open a bicycle repair shop, considered unsuitable work for a woman. Her medical file, spanning nearly 850 pages, documents repeated attempts to erase. Her mechanical interests, using hydrotherapy, forced feeding, and even surgery. Meanwhile, Dr. Henry Cotton at the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton claimed that mental illness came from hidden infections, leading to the removal of teeth, tonsils, and reproductive organs from thousands of female patients between 1907 and 1930. In 1946, Mary Jane Ward's The Snake Pit exposed similar abuse at Rockland State Hospital. Her research showed that in 1 year, 82% of electroshock treatments were given to women. Ward tells the story of Ruth Morrison, a 19-year-old girl committed for dancing too much, who endured 67 electric shocks over 6 months. Ward's book sparked a congressional investigation and helped pass the Mental Health Act of 1946, although real reform would take years. Olivia de Havilland's Oscar-nominated performance in the 1948 film adaptation brought these abuses to the public's attention, even though the movie softened some of the darker truths. Elizabeth Packard's fight against wrongful commitment began in 1860, when her husband had her institutionalized in Jacksonville for questioning religious doctrines. During her 3-year confinement, she documented 34 other women confined by similar means, including Sarah Menard, institutionalized for supporting women's rights and spiritualism, and Mary Shedd, locked away for refusing to attend her husband's church. After winning her freedom in 1864 through a jury trial, Packard became a tireless advocate for reform, helping change commitment laws in 4 states. Yet by 1927, 15 states still allowed husbands to commit wives without a medical evaluation or court hearing. Dr. Margaret Cav's 1913 study, The Autobiography of a Neurasthenic, shed new light on how women's mental health was misunderstood. Working at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, she recorded hundreds of cases in which ordinary reactions to difficult circumstances were treated as signs of illness. Her notes include Emma Dunbar, admitted in 1911 for reading too many foreign novels and neglecting housework, and Catherine Wells, institutionalized in 1912 for political hysteria after joining suffrage demonstrations. Cav's careful work influenced later feminist psychiatrists like Dr. Phyllis Chesler, whose 1972 book Women and Madness connected these historical abuses to the ongoing bias women face in mental health care. The records from London County Council Asylum in the 1920s reveal a troubling truth about how women were treated in mental hospitals. Many women were admitted not because they were truly sick, but because their behavior went against social expectations. Take the story of Dorothy Lawrence, a daring female war correspondent who had disguised herself as a male soldier during World War I after revealing her identity in 1919. She was sent to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum for claiming to be a war reporter. She spent the rest of her life in institutions, dying in 1964. Her diary, discovered in 1976, paints a heartbreaking picture of how her sense of self was destroyed through isolation, forced treatments, and constant monitoring. She recorded feeling stripped of her identity, as if the hospital had decided who she should be. Virginia Woolf's experiences also reflect the gendered nature of psychiatric care at the time. Beyond her well-known rest cure, her diaries reveal multiple encounters with male doctors who dismissed her ambitions and ideas. Between 1904 and 1912, Dr. George Savage even suggested that marriage could cure her drive for intellectual work. Woolf's private writings, found in 1990, describe the way doctors treated her mind like a toy they could twist or slow down at will. Her sister, Vanessa Bell, recalled a terrifying episode in 1915 when doctors forced Virginia to drink milk until she vomited, a common treatment for women labeled as hysterical. Hospital records from places like Burley House in 1910 show a consistent pattern of punishing her literary pursuits, treating creativity and intelligence as problems to fix. Across the Atlantic, the treatment of women in the United States was just as harsh. At the U.S. State Hospital in New York between 1900 and 1945, women were often punished for what doctors called diseases of womanhood. Dr. William Hammond's patient records reveal shocking practices. Women suffering from postpartum depression were sometimes forced to undergo ovarian compression, a painful procedure meant to reset their minds. Elena Richards, admitted in 1922 after losing her child, endured 47 such sessions over 3 months. The hospital's 1925 report showed that nearly 70% of female patients were admitted for reproductive or sexual issues, treated with everything from ice baths to forced feeding. Personal letters from Dr. Hammond, uncovered in 2003, confirm he believed that female bodies were the root of most mental problems in women. Some women, however, were under the care of female doctors, though even that did not spare them from harsh treatment. Dr. Alice Bennett, who led the female department at the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane from 1900 to 1935, kept meticulous records that illustrate the period's biases. One patient, Sarah Thompson, lost her child and grieved naturally, but the hospital treated her mourning as insanity. Her 432-page case file included letters she wrote to her family that were never sent. One note reads, "Today they held me under the cold water until I stopped crying. They say my tears are a symptom of my madness, but how can a mother not weep for her child?" Her case was later cited by Dr. Carl Menninger to show how institutions confused normal human emotions with mental illness. These practices were not limited to English-speaking countries. In Paris, the Salpêtrière Hospital under Dr. Jean Martin Charcot became famous for public demonstrations of women labeled as hysterical between 1862 and 1893. Charcot staged theatrical sessions where patients' fits were photographed for medical journals, often in highly controlled and unnatural poses. One patient, Augustine, became particularly well known through these demonstrations. These images and records remind us how women's natural emotions, ambitions, and defiance were frequently treated as signs of madness rather than normal human behavior. When feminist historians looked back at her medical records in the 1980s, they discovered that she had been admitted to a hospital at just 15 years old. Today, her symptoms would likely be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, caused by the abuse she endured. Across Europe, the influence of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris spread widely. Their dramatic demonstrations of so-called hysteria became a standard teaching tool in medical schools, with students observing women in staged fits, often for the sake of lectures rather than care. Meanwhile, in the United States, hospitals like Mount Pleasant State in Iowa clearly divided men and women into separate wings. with sharply different treatment approaches. Records from 1905 reveal that male patients were encouraged to participate in work programs, gardening, and outdoor activities, giving them a sense of purpose and routine. Women, however, were often put under strict supervision, with treatments aimed at suppressing their emotions or their intellectual energy. One striking example is the case of Margaret Schuyler, who was admitted in 1928 for her political activism, having organized meetings for women's suffrage. Instead of being praised for her engagement, Margaret was isolated for long periods, force-fed, and even restrained whenever she showed signs of excitement or strong emotion. At the same time, male patients displaying similar enthusiasm for politics were often applauded for their curiosity and drive, highlighting a shocking gender bias in mental health care. Yet amid these harsh conditions, brave individuals began to challenge the system. Dorothea Dix, working in the shadows of Victorian-era asylums, saw chains clanking against cold stone walls and heard desperate cries echoing through overcrowded corridors. She began her quiet revolution in 1841 after visiting the East Cambridge jail in Massachusetts. There, she discovered mentally ill inmates confined in freezing, filthy cells, many naked, chained, and beaten with rods. Horrified by what she saw, Dix devoted the next 40 years to changing how society treated people with mental illnesses. She meticulously documented her observations, and her 1843 memorial to the Massachusetts legislature described inmates held in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, and pens, often lashed into obedience. Her relentless advocacy led to the creation or expansion of 32 state psychiatric hospitals, including the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum and the Illinois State Hospital. Meanwhile, reformers in Europe were making significant strides. Philippe Painel famously removed chains from patients at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in 1793, and his student, Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, continued this work between 1818 and 1837. Esquirol founded 10 new mental hospitals and demonstrated that humane treatment could lead to remarkable recoveries. Across the English Channel, William Tuke established the York Retreat in 1796, emphasizing calm surroundings and compassionate care. By 1811, 61 out of 149 patients admitted to the retreat had fully recovered, an extraordinary success for the era. Tuke's grandson, Samuel Tuke, spread these ideas further with his 1813 book, Description of the Retreat. In the United States, Elizabeth Packard added another powerful voice to the reform movement during the 1860s, after her husband had her committed. Simply because she questioned his religious beliefs, Packard fought back, publishing The Prisoner's Hidden Life, which exposed the abuses and arbitrary nature of asylum commitments. Her tireless advocacy led to Illinois Packard Law in 1869, requiring a jury trial before anyone could be institutionalized. Reform efforts grew stronger in the 20th century. Clifford Beers, a former patient, shared his harrowing experiences. In A Mind That Found Itself, detailing 21 nights restrained in a straitjacket, his revelations caused a public outcry and led to the creation of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1909. Dr. Adolph Meyer, director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, pushed the field forward by treating the whole person rather than just the symptoms. Through individualized care and occupational therapy, Meyer reduced the use of restraints by 80%, setting new standards for humane treatment. Other pioneers followed, like Linda Richards, America's first trained nurse, who in 1882 started a formal psychiatric nursing program, emphasizing compassion, careful observation, and proper training for those caring for the mentally ill. These early efforts laid the foundation for modern mental health care. While progress was slow, the courage of reformers, patients, advocates, and medical professionals alike gradually transformed the way society viewed and treated people struggling with mental illness. replacing chains, isolation, and cruelty with understanding, therapy, and hope. Her lessons were all about treating people with respect and really listening to them. By 1915, her program had trained over 500 nurses who carried these ideas to hospitals all across the country. They didn't just follow rules, they made sure patients were treated with dignity and care. Around the same time, a brave journalist named Nellie Bly went undercover as a patient at Blackwell's Island Asylum. In 1887,